Welcome to From Our Generation, where we uncover the ideas and events that shape the world we live in today. I'm Crom Carmichael.
And I'm Mike Hassel.
Together we'll explore the past to better understand the present, because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how you think about it. Well, Michael, it's June 13th, 2025, and this is From Our Generation, and we have a topic that is near and dear to you today, and so I'd like for you to kind of lead today's discussion, and I will respond.
Okay. So, last week we were talking about rights, and there's a confusing variety of rights, whether they're powers, whether they're entitlements, different kinds of rights are both of those things. And so we had this roller coaster discussion about that. One of the kind of between the lines subjects is power. And we live in a time when both parties think the other is trying to be authoritarian. You hear that word thrown around a lot. Or,
Yep.
And so the question is, what is the right amount of power for what purpose in the hands of whom? Okay,
Yep.
That's one way of putting it.
Yep.
So what I've done in the last week, since we had that discussion, is to think about what I call the cousins of power, the related topics that we're going to kind of take a walk through today and see what kind of light we can shed on how power works and maybe how it should change from the way it's structured today. Okay, so we have a slide here for those who can view this. And basically, we'll start with responsibility and duty, right? Those are fairly clear concepts. They're typically self-directed, right? I have a duty, right? Maybe we have a duty. So it can be construed collectively.
Now, do you have create a distinction between responsibility and duty?
I really don't. They're pretty interchangeable for
Okay.
me, but there might be a useful distinction.
Okay.
Basically, there are obligations that you have, or a responsibility is a power. I'm responsible for me, right? And I have then the authority to do things about me,
Okay.
right? I may not have quite so much authority to act on our behalf.
Now, what about family?
Well, I was about to say,
Okay.
in family, I would have responsibility for my family. I can't really act on behalf of you.
Okay.
We're partners in lots of things.
How about Susan?
About Susan, she's got her own responsibilities.
Okay.
Right. And
So are they joint in the way that you
sometimes.
think about it? Yeah.
Sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
Okay.
we behave like partners in a lot of ways, and it works very well. And some people think that you need one source of power, and the power divided or accountability especially, divided is no accountability.
Okay.
Like you have co-CEOs in a company, when something goes wrong, who do you blame?
Yeah, right. That makes it tough.
When I hire vendors, I like one vendor that gets the rest, because
Right.
if something goes wrong, I know who to point to and who to get relief from.
And duty, the way I'm thinking of duty is because of the position I hold, I have a required responsibility.
It's part of
So-
the definition of your position.
Yes. In other words, if I'm a parent, as children often say, I didn't ask to be born.
Yeah.
You get
Right.
get that, okay?
Right.
But as a parent, you have a duty because they are subordinate to you as children.
And you're responsible
In your
for
family.
them.
You're responsible, but you have a duty to be responsible.
Yeah.
In other words, you can be irresponsible, but you're shirking your duty.
Yes.
Yeah. So I mean,
so
it's,
they're
it's-
kind of intertwined.
they're intertwined,
in
but
that
slightly
sense.
different. Yeah. Okay.
So, then the question becomes, who has what authority?
Mhm.
Now, the distinction between duty and authority is very interesting to me. When I started my career, I worked at a big company that had a system called brand management. And so you had a lot of responsibility, say for a whole business, like a $200 million business.
Mhm.
I wasn't the brand manager, but I was a couple levels below. It was a group of 5 of us that kind of were told, you've got responsibility for this $200 million business, okay? Problem is, we didn't have any authority. We didn't set pricing. We couldn't compel people to do things. We basically had to convince them to do things.
Okay.
So it's a great place to start your career, because you've got a lot of opportunity and responsibility, but not a whole lot of power. So how do you make that work? It's a great test to develop your leadership skills, your persuasive skills,
Yeah.
et cetera. And you can't do too much damage because you don't have too much authority to make people do things they ought not do.
Yeah.
Right. So that's the way I remember that. But I think it's useful for us to kind of probe into this distinction between authority and responsibility and how this is working in our political system now.
Well, let's do this. Before you jump into that, you have the private, I'm going to call it the private sector, which includes family and anything that is not government. It's
Yes.
not controlled by the government.
Right.
And in those cases, the responsibility and duty, especially in the world of business, is as the CEO of a company, you have a duty to a bunch of different constituents.
Sure.
You have a duty to your employees.
Yep.
You have a duty to your shareholders,
Your
and you have a
customers.
duty to your customers. Yeah, and if you succeed in managing those duties well, then the business will thrive.
And that's a private sector way of understanding that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think you and I both know that increasingly a CEO has a bunch of duties to government.
Right.
They are at least as important as your employees. Maybe not as important as your customer, but you've got to pay attention. You've got to comply.
Yeah.
Or you're out of business.
Yeah, and that is not necessarily a duty that benefits your employees, your customers, or your shareholders. It's a requirement because of, as you're going to get into later, the power of government,
Right.
and its authority to in fact, it can abuse power because it can.
And
it's kind of like parents who say, "Oh, well, why do I have to do that? Because I say so."
I said so. So, we're not anarchists.
Yeah.
We're not here to argue that this is a completely inappropriate power.
Right.
The question is, what is the extent of it?
Right.
And I think you and I would agree that limited power, a limited government was the vision of our founders, and it's the appropriate vision that we no longer quite execute.
Right.
And that too much power is in the hands of a government is counterproductive. We mentioned earlier that unproductive investment is stuff that people wouldn't choose to buy unless they have to.
Right.
This really fits in that category.
Absolutely.
There's a lot of things you have to pay for that you wouldn't do it if you had a choice.
That's correct.
Okay. So a lot of our discourse, in social media has got people flying around with terms like dictator, autocrat, Nazi.
Yes.
And they're basically resentments for power that people have.
Oligarch. Oligarch was Bernie Sanders' favorite word for about 2 weeks.
Yes. Do you think it's fair to characterize that as expressing resentments for someone else's power?
Mm-hmm.
And generally, you have each side resenting the power of the other to force them to do something.
Mm-hmm.
I think the Wall Street Journal long ago had a famous editorial that said, "We live between guardrails." And our institutions kind of put up boundaries beyond which neither side can push, and each is panicked that their guardrail is going to give way. And they're pushing the other side as hard as they can against the other guardrail. And so you end up with contests over power as opposed to collaboration over mutual well-being.
Yeah, and our Constitution tried to put up guardrails. In fact, it did put up guardrails on our federal government.
Yes.
It said this is how these are the areas of authority that you have, and outside of those areas, those go to the states.
Yeah. So just to repeat what we've said in a couple of prior podcasts, these are known as enumerated powers. They're specifically listed and given to the government in the Constitution with the provision that anything not listed here, you don't have the power to do.
That's the federal government.
The federal government. And so that was left to the states. It explicitly says any other power is left to the states.
Mm-hmm.
And so what has changed over particularly the last century, since the Constitution was written, was about 250 years ago. But for 150 years, it didn't change much. The government was still small, $3 billion, I think, as you've said, when Coolidge was president. Now you have a federal government that's involved with health care, with pensions, with roads, with energy.
It's involved in
housing,
virtually everything.
Virtually everything.
Yeah.
And some people seem to think that the president ought to touch every one of these areas.
Right.
Right. All of these issues are personalized in one power in the executive branch.
And when you use the term the government, you're really talking in this context the federal government.
Yes.
Okay.
Well,
Because we have a federal, we have a state, we have a local government. Yeah. That's how we're organized. But the federal powers have now grown tentacles, and they extend over virtually every issue that a state or local government is involved in. That wasn't the original intent.
Yeah. So the point I was trying to make is the original intent is the federal government could do none of that except for, I think it was justice, print money, and have a common defense.
Right.
There's a court system, and that was kind of it.
That's it.
And so all these other things have now accumulated under the purview of the federal government. Before, it was left to the states. I read a quote this week that now's a good time for me to impart here. Okay. It was from Keir Starmer, who's the Prime Minister of England, and apparently he went to the north of England a couple of weeks ago.
Great Britain.
Well, Great Britain, yes. He was in England, but yes, yeah. He's the Prime Minister of Great Britain.
Yeah.
Yes. Thank you. And apparently there's panic there that this guy named Farage is getting a lot of political momentum. Mm-hmm. He is kind of the Trump of England.
Yes.
Okay, and so the establishment powers do not like this. And he said of Farage, he said this: you can't trust him with your job, your mortgage, your pension, your bills, or your future. Now, this is intended to persuade people that they ought to be afraid of Farage.
Yeah.
The way I read this is, what the hell does the government have to do with controlling all of that on the average citizen's behalf?
Well, and Keir Starmer thinks that Keir Starmer should have the authority.
Yes.
Because he's saying you can't trust him, but you can trust me.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the assumption is that this is naturally the responsibility of the central government, mm-hmm. what we call federal government in our country.
Right.
Okay. So what do we have to say about the sources of power? I find this very interesting. In preparing, I was trying to really think about what are the categories of things that can shed some light on this question of power. And one of them is, where does power come from? So, let's list a few of them. We have the law. We have elections. Now, these are public sources of power, right? Now, in private power, we have ownership. If I own it, I have the power to dispose of it. Mm-hmm. Well, that's compromised now by regulation.
Yeah.
Where there's only certain things I can do with my money or the things that I own. Regulation now is a big, heavy blanket over what we do with the things that we own.
Which has a cost.
Exactly.
That has a cost.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so among the things we own is money. If we have capital, if we've accumulated capital, any kind of wealth, generally in the private sector, it's up to me to do with that what I want, invest it as I want, spend it as I want. Regulation, again, compromises that. And then in the natural world, there's strength. We've talked about a state of nature, and bullies and people with physical power can get their way in a natural state. A lot of animals do this, right?
Yeah,
they just prevail by sheer power.
Yeah.
But among more civilized people, charisma, social skills, those things are a source of power to get what you want, particularly if you're like Bill Clinton and you have this mesmerizing effect on people where they think that you're listening to them, that their priorities are his priorities. That's an enormous source of power for talented political figures.
Right.
And I think we could agree that he was one in that way.
Yes, he was.
And then there's an odd new twist on this in the last decades in the West. You get power from being a victim, which is an inversion. We talked about having power from having a physical force, right? Strength, or having a talent, which is charisma. But this is not a talent and it's not a physical force. It's the opposite of those. It's the lack of those things. To be a victim empowers you in important ways in our culture.
Yeah, and that's especially true historically. We have had real victims. I mean, people who would be defined as victims by anybody. Back before the Civil War, you had slavery. Black people were clearly victims before slavery, and then black people were clearly victims for a significant period of time after that. And there is still some level of systemic racism, but as a person who's in his 70s, I've seen how things have evolved, and the effect of the effect of racism today is way less than it was before from the standpoint of everyday life. Now, there's still people who claim because they're black that they are victims and therefore should have a great deal of power. And in fact, it's some people who have a great deal of power who are black who claim that they should be able to exert their power in ways that that if a person in that position were white couldn't do it. So it's really interesting. And then women before suffrage, before women's rights to vote, they were certainly second class citizens when it came to the vote.
Yes.
And then we went through a period of time where women were entering the workforce, where there was discrepancies in pay, there were discrepancies in opportunity, but there's a point at which the government's power to
Remedy?
Thank you. To remedy racism or to remedy sexism becomes so expensive and so racist and sexist itself that it becomes oppressive for everybody except the very few who claim the victimhood status that you're describing.
Well, this raises the question of equality.
Yeah.
You know, if you remove the barriers to equality in the law, if you're equal in the eyes of the law,
Mm-hmm.
then that is a form of equality that's unsatisfactory to a lot of egalitarians now, who say it goes beyond that. You need equal status, you need equal wealth, you need equal outcomes, et cetera.
Mm-hmm.
The amount of oppression that it would take to produce that, the amount of force that you would have to apply to reduce the assets, the skills, the accomplishments of some people to meet those of others is beyond what's tolerable in a free society. So the part of the question is, do we still have meaningful racism and anti-feminism? Maybe is the word that comes to mind. But is it as bad as it's ever been? Or is it really a lot better than it was 100 years ago, 200 years ago? We're still trying to wring out some remnants of
Sure.
this. But does that call for affirmative action? I mean, these are active legal cases now.
Yes.
Where basically the thought is DEI is a form of racism.
Mm-hmm.
It is favoring people to get jobs and to get admissions to schools and things like that, other than, say, Asian people or white people. So it's a formal, explicit form of exclusion,
Right.
or preference.
Right. Well, there's actually been a Supreme Court ruling just recently, I believe, in the state of Ohio, where a heterosexual woman sued because she claimed that her boss, who was gay, promoted a person over her because the other person was gay and she was straight. And the Supreme Court ruled 9-0 in her favor.
Well, the law had said that because she was in a majority group, which
Yes.
is a white group, right?
Right.
Women are not
White,
majority.
heterosexual.
Okay. Because she was in a majority group, she had to prove something that other people wouldn't have to prove in order to prove prejudice.
Right. And the Supreme Court said, no, that's not the case.
Yeah, everybody has the same standard for
Yes.
proving it.
And I think that's a case. You know, there's some cases even today that some rulings from the Supreme Court that I think are not helpful.
Yeah.
But this one is one that, because it was 9-0, it says that discrimination is wrong, period.
Yeah.
Well, that really is I think a real improvement in our constant battle to try to create equality rather than equity.
Yeah.
And the distinction there is equality is you're all at the starting line and you have the same opportunity to run the race.
In the eyes of the law.
In the eyes of the law.
formal eyes. It may be that you're not as well educated, you're stupid, and there's a lot of reasons you're not going to succeed, Crom, and I am.
Yeah.
Right? That can't be remedied by the law.
Correct.
But in the eyes of the law, if you have the opportunity to match your skills against mine, your resources, your tolerance for risk, all of that, then we have a just society.
Right. And then somebody's going to win the race.
Right.
I mean, it's interesting how much we love to watch sports. But we love to watch sports, and at the end of every sporting event, there's a winner.
Yes.
Which means, by definition, they're losers.
Sure.
And we recognize that this is what creates excellence, is the fact that at the end of the event, the best wins.
Well, the striving to get the extra 0.1%, that's really what underlies it.
Exactly.
I wrote a book last year called Deep Trade-Offs, and part of it is the trade-off between peace and striving. You can't do both, right? And striving is really where we get a lot of meaning in our lives.
Mhm.
And so I have some support for that idea that activity is better than leisure. That we don't get happy when we sit on a couch and have nothing to do. We get happy when we're engaged in accomplishing something.
Yes.
And there's a lady that wrote a book called Grit, Angela Duckworth,
Okay.
who is a professor, I think, at Yale. And it's a really powerful book, but basically it says the main component of success is grit. It's persistence, it's effort, it's stamina,
Mhm.
it's determination. And those are all things we have within our control. Talent is not so much within our control. And as she says, it doesn't matter as much. It is a factor,
Mhm.
but the main thing is grit. And so I think we can take some encouragement from this idea that a system that recognizes and rewards effort and grit and rewards winners at the end is going to bring that out of people. It's going to make people flourish and be more prosperous than one that tries to reward everyone equally, no matter what their
Well, yeah, and I
input
mean,
is.
if, a person who's very much in the news these days is Elon Musk, and before he got into the news from a governmental standpoint, everybody still knew who he was because he's one of the great innovators of our time and maybe even in history. Because it's like 6 or 7 different businesses that there's some overlap, but there's a great deal of difference. And what he and in building those businesses, he has created a tremendous amount of opportunities for other people to be successful along with him. And it's and then the products that he builds, Starlink, and what that does in the whole field of communication. Then when he's doing with his AI company, and what he's doing with his robotics company. The one company that I still don't I don't see, but I think it's doing things is the one that builds tunnels.
Yeah, they call it the Boring Company.
The boring, yeah, yes, yeah, and it is this very efficient way.
And he started out as the founder of PayPal,
Yes,
which revolutionized the way we pay things. So
Yes.
he's been involved in 5 or 6 ways that have profoundly improved the world.
yeah,
And in my opinion, he deserves his money.
right. But he's also in the process of him making himself a great deal of money and increased his wealth. He was the wealthiest man in the world. There are lots of other people who are multimillionaires, and then there are people who take advantage of the products that he makes to their personal benefit. He creates winners up and down the line, up and down the line.
So you have, just in our generation, you have Jeff Bezos at Amazon, you have the founders of Google, you have Steve Cook now, and before him, Jobs.
Tim Cook.
Tim Cook, yeah.
Tim Cook and Steve Jobs. Yeah.
At Apple, you have Reed, I think it's Hastings or something at Netflix. Enormous fortunes, but they have produced things that improve everybody's lives.
Right.
Now a lot of people want to take that money away from them because it's not equal. They're not equal to the rest of us. In my opinion, they've earned their money. Microsoft, what they brought, the order that they brought to the whole new computing paradigm, as opposed to having a government come in and say, you'll all use this product or this system so computers can talk to one another. They essentially accomplished that through private means.
Yeah,
enormous.
And what's also interesting is that on the subject of Microsoft in particular and the nature of competition and open markets, when Steve Jobs founded Apple, he put a wall. He called it the walled garden, and the original Apple desktop computers had to have an operating system, and he created that operating system. He would not let any other laptop or desktop computer manufacturers use the Apple operating system.
Yes.
And it was his resistance to licensing his know-how and his technology to others that gave rise to Microsoft. And so Bill Gates said, well, if he's not going to do it, I'll create an operating system, and I will license that operating system to all the other desktop computer manufacturers.
So, I have an electrical engineering degree and then went to a marketing company and then got an MBA. And so I started my career in this very sector.
Okay.
Difference between those two systems called open and closed architecture. The closed architecture is what Jobs chose because there's more controllable. You can control the user experiences. You don't have as many crashes, conflicts between different ways of doing things that reduce the user experience. And that meant they grew a lot more slowly than Microsoft. Microsoft chose an open architecture where you had dozens, hundreds, thousands of people developing applications for the DOS operating system and then Windows, and it produced instability.
Yeah.
A lot of ways for bad guys to get in and manipulate the system because it was open architecture.
Well, what Jobs also did was he forced the consumer to buy an Apple computer.
That's right.
And they were very high priced
Yeah.
relative to the desktops made by companies that used the Microsoft operating system.
Yeah, it looked like they were going to lose the computer race.
Well, they did, and
Yeah.
In that sense, they lost that race. They still make a very fine product, but their market share in desktop computers is tiny.
Mhm.
But it also almost broke the company. And what's interesting is just Steve Jobs got fired as CEO of Apple.
Right.
They brought in I don't remember the person's name, but he had been the CEO of Pepsi, and they
Yeah.
brought him in for a period of time, and he wasn't a technologist, and so he did not. He failed as being the CEO of Apple. They brought Jobs back as the CEO, but they moved Tim Cook into the COO. And I, while I have nothing to base this on per se, I'm convinced that when Steve Jobs came back, they said, "You're the visionary on the product side. Tim Cook, you're the visionary on the business model side." And the difference between the old Apple and the new Apple, to your point, is the open system. When the iPhone came out, they had the App Store.
Yes.
And anybody who wanted to build an app and have it put in the App Store had to agree to pay a percentage of their revenue
In order to get in the system. And they vetted it and made sure that it wasn't going to crash
correct
their phones and things like that.
And so Apple's business model is one where tens of thousands, maybe even more people who are not on Apple's payroll create apps that go on the Apple phone and generate revenue for themselves and generate revenue for Apple. And that is the leverage of that is absolutely mind-boggling, which is why Apple's market cap got up over $3 trillion.
So let's bring this back to the concept of power that we're talking about. These things are an enormous source of power in a free market.
Mm-hmm.
People can create and innovate. In our lifetime, we've seen enormous innovation. I think we're going to see more in our children's lifetime with the advent of having decoded the DNA, the genome.
Right.
It happened once in the whole of human history. I think it was in the late 90s.
Yeah.
And we're still just starting to encroach on what is available from that information.
Yep.
Now we have AI, and who knows? I used to think, well, the internet has superseded just microcomputing. We have this great new paradigm. And it only took about 20, 30 years for an AI to come along. That's a whole new layer.
Yes.
Who knows what the next layer and the layer after that are going to be?
And here's what's interesting about our discussion here about power and authority and whatnot. Government has, because I'm going to say that government officials don't really understand technology very well.
And the law never gets ahead of this. It's always behind.
Right. And so people who create technology, they're not impeded much by government. Whereas manufacturers, where you had a heavy component of labor and people in the workforce who are not technology sitting in an office, government over the years in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s encroached and put more and more cost on manufacturers. And the executives of those companies then say, rather than fight the government, I'll just move my production overseas.
Well, the industries that produce this kind of innovation we've been describing are lightly regulated.
Yes.
They're so far ahead of the law that they are left alone. And of course, now the law is trying to catch up with them. Europe's trying to rein in Apple, and there's a bunch of issues that come as the public-spirited folks want to take the reins over some of this.
Well, they want the money. They want the money. They want to use their power because the Europeans all of the major technology companies in the world, or the technologies, let's put it that way, all of them started in the U.S. And because of our foundational principles in the U.S. of rewarding and protecting innovation.
Yes.
And even in China, for example, there's some big technology companies in China, but TikTok was a copy of Instagram. Baidu was a copy of Google. So the Chinese companies that dominate China from a technology standpoint are Chinese copies of U.S. companies and technology, and the Europeans, because there's so much wealth created by technology because of the nature of its productivity, and the Europeans, none of the technologies were created in Europe, even though the EU has a larger population than the United States. None of those ideas and technologies were developed over there, and the people in authority over there, they want part of the money. So now they're trying to figure out how to tax and regulate. And President Trump is saying, no. If you're going to do that, here's how I'm going to react to you. And so now you have competition.
This chess game.
That's the chess game. Yeah.
And Europe is trying to do this. They have systems that are not nearly as open as ours. You also don't see nearly as much innovation in Europe. They are stagnating.
Correct.
Technologically and I think culturally, because they don't face the future with quite as much lack of inhibition. Right, but think about China. They have the communist system, the compliance burden there. Basically, if you don't comply with what the CCP wants, you're not going to prevail.
Right.
They'll put you out of business.
Right.
And there's a lot of ways that they do that. And so they're good at systematizing things and plowing subsidies into making things big, but they're not good at innovating.
Mm-hmm.
So
That's correct.
Part of what we're saying is that there's power in innovation. That's really where better lives come from,
Mm-hmm.
is innovation. And in a private sector, that comes from being lightly burdened.
Right. Now, the people, though, who are in charge of those companies, getting back to the main point here of power and its cousins, they are constrained by customers.
Sure.
Because if they don't produce a high quality technology that people want to use and pay, and to use it to pay for it, then their companies and many technology companies go out of business.
Yeah, let's turn to constraints and limiting principles. Before we do, I want to tell one story.
Okay.
About 20 years ago, I went to Scotland, and I was reading a book about the Scottish diaspora. You know, diaspora is a spreading. It refers to the Irish after the potato famine. They spread all over the world, particularly the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Jews have spread out as they had to after they were hammered in Europe at World War II. So a diaspora is a spreading.
Yeah, by the way, just to your point, there are like 30 to 40 million people who are descendants of the Irish in the United States.
Yeah, there's like 8 million in Ireland.
Yeah.
It's incredible.
Yeah.
As they came where they could flourish.
Right.
For lots of reasons. It's not just the government. It's physical limitations and other things.
Yes.
But they have flourished. So I was reading this book about the Scottish diaspora, and it's very interesting telling there that this happened beginning in the 1700s, where they had, I think, called the Act of Union, where the Scottish are very proud, they're nomads. They went from one place to the next to get food because it's not a very fertile area. And so it's the source of redneck culture, Scots-Irish, which I am Scots-Irish. I recognize this, where they fight hard, work hard, drink hard. And so there's just a culture that goes with Scottish. And what they said is that when the Act of Union happened, they basically got the advantages of getting into the English mercantile system, which is already well developed with worldwide trade. They traded with India. They traded, with the United States, or I guess the colonies would have been in the early 1700s. But there was this enormous commercial system they could get into, and they could sell their stuff. So things like Lipton tea, I believe, is Scottish. But I know Dewar's Scotch was started, and then you had the Industrial Revolution in Glasgow.
Right.
And the book was making the point that they were far enough away from London, to not be interfered with.
From the English.
The English in London.
Because you had the English, the Scottish, and the Irish.
Yeah.
And while a lot of people think they're all the same,
No, very different. But this is the point that I'm making.
Yeah.
When I say they were this far from London, the English couldn't control them. they didn't have the technology to even know everything they were doing.
Right.
So the taxation and all that was quite light, but the advantages of getting to this enormous worldwide system was available to them. So that combination produced the Scottish Enlightenment, which was an intellectual movement with Adam Smith and David Hume and people we've talked about when we did these tapes on Great Ideas of History.
And the
But
giants,
also
and that's the giantsofpoliticalthought.com, which
Yes.
we encourage people who listen to our podcast
Take
to
a
go
look.
to the giantsofpoliticalthought.com because so much of what we talk about historically,
It's drawn
those
from our
ideas,
experience with
yeah,
that.
yeah.
But you had the Industrial Revolution in Glasgow too. Another way that this combination of light compliance and private innovation just made people thrive.
Yeah, and here's what's interesting to your point is that, and we're getting a little bit off topic,
Yeah.
but not very far, and that is that the English, that the U.S. colonies had the same kind of advantages that the Scottish had because there was no telephone back in those days, and so for communication to take place between the colonies and England took weeks.
Yeah, by boat.
Weeks by boat,
sailboat, right?
Both ways. I mean, had to go both ways, and then by the time they went there and got back, circumstances had changed anyway, and so the English didn't know much about what was going on in the colonies. They did a few things that upset the colonists, and that led to the War of Independence. But it really is when you're left alone. It's interesting how human beings, if they're left alone, will innovate. It's natural within human beings. Now, some people have more innovative genes than others. I'm not a creative person. I appreciate creativity tremendously and want it to thrive and want the conditions to be there because creativity and innovation improves virtually everybody's lot in life.
Right.
And but it is interesting. Your point is that even though England and Scotland were relatively, compared to England and the colonies, were relatively close together, it was still far enough away.
Yes.
For the Scottish to do what they did.
Yes, and so you mentioned the War for Independence,
Yeah.
and that is another really aspect of power. If you get independence, you're empowered to run your own life.
Yes.
If you have other peoples that are dependent on you, then you have the power to make them succeed or fail, right? Or certainly to influence whether they succeed or fail. Some people see everything in the world as about power.
Mhm.
I resist that because I think there's other ways of understanding things than just who is winning the power race.
Well, power that is misused hurts the general public to the benefit of the few.
Yes.
And that's a general principle that applies because of what we talked about on the island, the nature of time. You want innovation, but one of the byproducts of innovation is the innovator who is successful is personally going to do better than everybody else because they're taking advantage of the innovation and he gets a small amount.
And he owns it. So the island was a lesson
Yeah.
that we kind of imparted, a little model in episode 1 of this podcast to sort of talk about how rights and innovation work.
Right. And, it's kind of like the Bill Gates was one of the founders of Microsoft. He's the one who's the most famous of the founders. I think Paul Allen was his partner, and I think there might have been some other people that were.
Those are the main two.
Those were the main two.
Steve
And,
Ballmer came in later. He was
an executive, and it did
but
very well.
Yeah, he wasn't the original
No.
group.
But what's interesting is this: is what Microsoft what Microsoft at its essence, what it did was it helped people save time. The spreadsheet. I heard somebody once say that mergers and acquisitions and the wouldn't happen if there weren't for the ability for people to change a couple of numbers in a spreadsheet, hit a button, and redo all the forecasts.
So I had an interview with the founder of the inventor of the spreadsheet.
Oh, wow.
His name is Daniel Bricklin.
Okay.
So I was at Harvard Business School, and I wanted to get into this sector. I had an electrical engineering degree and marketing experience, and now an MBA. And so I looked up. I called Lotus 123, went and talked to Mitch Kapoor, who had started that company. He said, "Oh, you can't make an influence here. You should look for a smaller company." They had 70 people, and they ended up with many thousands.
Yeah.
But I also had an interview with Daniel Bricklin. So he had been an MIT student, came to Harvard Business School, and he was doing a finance class with a paper ledger. And so he'd do a total, and then some number would change, and he had to do all the subtotals He said, "This is BS. A computer will do this in a quarter of a second."
Yeah.
So he just built a little spreadsheet with a grid, and that is the beginning of the spreadsheets. He
Yeah.
made a deal with another guy in the class. He would get 50%. The other guy would get 50%. And then that failed. It was a business called VisiCalc.
I remember that name.
VisiCalc, and it was made for, I think, Apple computers before IBM came along. IBM just came along in the middle of this.
Okay.
And so they made it for Apple. And what happened was the business models evolved very quickly to be more like royalties for a book,
Yes.
where the owner gets 10 or 15, the creator, and then there's all 40% for marketing and all this other stuff that people have to pay for, right? But he was stuck with 50%, the guy that was selling it, and he could not compete and give Bricklin 50%. Bricklin would not relent and say, "Okay, I'll take the new, 10 or 15,"
So the business model,
and it died.
the business model was broken.
Yeah.
Yeah, interesting. But the point here is that it was that innovation that saved people who had to do those types of 10-year projections.
It was the perfect product because the analysts that were valuing the stock were the very people that benefited the most.
Yeah.
As you say, mergers and acquisitions, they could do complicated financial models and change them in an instant,
Right.
and see the implications.
And that's what software does. And so someone spends 1,000, let's say, or even 10,000 hours
Yeah.
creating a software that does something, and then that saves everybody else millions of hours in the aggregate.
Yes. And
That's what creates value
Yes.
for the person that created it in the first place, and everybody is happy to pay for it, because if I can pay what costs me an hour of my time in order to save 10 hours of time, that's a simple decision.
huge.
Yeah,
Huge.
and that's what cars do. That's what everything that we value when you get right down to the essence of it, it saves us time, or it makes things easier.
One wrinkle I'll add here, I hope it's interesting to our listeners, is that Microsoft's contribution to this was to separate software from the hardware.
Yes.
Because before that, software was encoded in the hardware, like an automobile engine, for instance, has a camshaft,
Okay.
has little egg-shaped things that spin, and the shape of that egg controls the way the valves open and shut
Okay.
to let the gas in and the exhaust out.
Okay.
It's basically encoded in that oval. It has to be a certain shape.
Yeah.
Well, if you separate out those kind of instructions into software that can be changed easily while the machine doesn't change,
Right.
there's a lot more flexibility, and then therefore adaptation and innovation. And so that was really Microsoft's great contribution that then allowed all these computers to work together, because the flexibility to adjust until they could get them talking.
Yeah, and to pull this back into the topic of the day, those
Which is power.
those industries were free to have their own authority, and then succeed or fail.
Right.
In other words, their success or failure was completely unrelated to any government policy, because government didn't interfere.
Right.
So the use of power by government to squash innovation is a and they can squash it by regulation or taxation. There are two ways that government can tax something to the point where nobody will do it,
Right.
or they can regulate to the point where businesses won't do it, or they'll move. And part of what I want to get to, Mike, while we're talking about power is because our Constitution tried to disperse power, tried to have checks and balances, because it recognized that human beings, if they got power, would help themselves, because of human nature. Human nature can be very beneficial, because it has within human nature is innovation, or it can be abusive.
Sure.
And everybody wants to better their lot in life, and they can better their lot in life by creating products that help others, or they can better their lot in life by taking and using. But in order to do that and do it under the quote law, there has to be a law that allows them to do it.
So you and I have been in the startup business for half a century.
Yes.
And we know that pretty much any innovation steps on the toes of somebody that has a vested interest in the old way of doing things. So, it's not that the whole world runs to a mousetrap. There's a famous invented mousetrap and the world comes running. No, that's just 10% of it. The real burden is in educating and re-habituating people, training them into seeing a new way and accepting and believing and adopting
Right.
your vision of how things can be different. And it fails most of the time.
Right.
There's a lot of momentum in human behavior and all that. So doing something that's compelling enough generally has to be like tenfold. You make something that's 50% better or 2 times better, it might work a little bit. But the ones that gallop away are orders of magnitude
Well,
improvements in how you can do things.
when the people who originally invented the laptop, the desktop computer, I think it was they asked their parents, and they said, "Well, you'll sell 10 of them, or maybe 100 of them." I mean, in other words, innovations are by definition. They're so new that human beings are creatures of habit.
Right.
Now, when you offer humans a way to do something that's better, some people will do it sooner than others. Some people will adopt, the early adopters. They'll adopt it sooner than others, but then others see it and they benefit, and so then it becomes part of the way we do things.
Sure.
Netflix started where they would mail you a disc in the mail,
Right.
and that was kind of an innovative way.
Didn't have to go to the store.
Didn't have to go to Blockbuster,
Right.
but it was still the same. It was still the same disc. They just made it simpler. And then once the internet got big enough and powerful enough where data could flow, the discs went away, and that's kind of the nature of innovation. But circling back, what I wanted to get to is that you have the family unit, you have and there's certain dynamics of power and authority within the family unit. Then you have the community, and then you have the states.
Mm-hmm.
Then you have a national government. And then you have the globalists, the global system. And it's important, I think, to restrain the human nature's bad side, the dark side, to always have competition among the institutions. Because if you have competition, if the globalists said this is how the whole world should work, there's still human beings who get to make that decision. And when they make it, they do make sure that they're doing just fine themselves.
They're going to, be at the top of the heap.
They're going to be at the top of the heap, and they won't change from that. And so what you want is, you don't want there to be a system where you can, by just brute force, be at the top of the heap. And that's why competition, and that's what's happening in the world today as we see it. You now see a reordering of the global economy. The World Economic Forum, the last one they had at Davos, after Trump had won the last election, the top guy got up there and he admitted, he said, Trump's election means that our vision of the world is doomed. And my answer to that was, his whole
idea was make America great. It was nationalistic. It was, we're working in our interest.
Right. And we're working in everybody's interest, and give us the power to reorder the entire globe, and we'll make everybody better off.
So you're paraphrasing what the World Economic Forum's point of view was.
Right.
They were going to work in the interest of the whole world.
That was what they claimed.
Yes.
Now, whether or not they did it, whether or not they were successful in helping everybody is an open question. But whether or not they would personally benefit,
not very open question.
It's not an open question. They would, and that's why they all fly in there in big private jet planes.
Yeah. So let's turn to the limitations on power. You've mentioned competition.
Yes.
That's an obvious limitation in a free market, and it protects the buyer. Let's start with that point. It does not protect the seller.
No.
A seller's enemy is vigorous competition, because if you're not very close to the top, well, one of the things we learned in business school is differentiation is everything. Because if you're not different, you're going to compete on price.
Right.
Okay, so you've got to have better service, better product, better something, or else.
And you have to do one other thing. You have to figure out how to always produce a high quality product at a lower and lower cost.
Exactly.
If you're not focusing on quality at a lower cost, you will be beaten by somebody who is.
Well, people are pretty smart, and they're particularly highly motivated to get the best they can for the cheapest price.
Right.
That's a very reliable aspect of human nature. So competition in markets is a check on concentration of power in commercial entities.
Right. So in a market system, what I'm hearing you say is the consumer is the one with the authority.
Exactly. It's a parallel to democracy.
Yeah.
Where the citizen is the one in charge.
Yes. And that's why elections should matter. In fact, in our society, you really want candidates to tell the voters in very clear language what they will do if elected, and then do it, because our elections are the market. They're the opportunity for the customer, the voter, to register what they want. And in a representative government that we call our democracy, elections should matter, and that's how the customer, the voter, gets to register their desire.
So let's shift a little bit to the limiting principles of power. One of the things we know from our work in the giants of political thought is that the founders were concerned above all with tyranny, with preventing tyranny.
Right.
Now, there was the tyranny of a king, so they balanced power and separation of powers and federalism and all of that. But they also were particularly afraid of the tyranny of the majority. Now, in the private sector, a majority of people buying your product you kind of like, right? That's not so much a threat. But when you have coercive power in government, the power of majority is a big problem. You get 51% that force the other 49%. And we're kind of close to that now. We have a very divided electorate, and we swing from one to the other. And the policy difference is so large that the party out of power experiences this as oppression.
Yeah, and part of what our founders tried to do by limiting the powers of the national government and empowering the states to govern the citizens within their own boundaries was to create competition among the states. So if a particular state became very oppressive of its citizens,
you move down the road.
The citizen could simply move to another state.
Yes.
And so one of the other things that the Constitution did provide was that interstate commerce you couldn't create barriers to interstate commerce state to state. The states did not have the power or the authority to do that. They couldn't tariff goods from another state.
Yes.
And so it created a level playing field among the states. And then if the states abused their power, their citizens could move. And that was a way to address this point that you're making about a tyranny of the majority.
Yes.
By making it so you had to get the majorities of every single state, which was a virtual impossibility.
Yeah, and so they set up an electoral system with the Electoral College with the same kinds of objectives to disperse power so nobody could get their hands on it and manipulate an election.
Right.
And rights, we need to say, is
recognizing, by the way, that human nature would be that people would try to manipulate.
Well, sure.
Would try to manipulate the outcome of elections.
They have for 250 years.
Yeah.
I mean, there's all kinds of stories about electoral corruption. It's still a controversy that remains with us. Pretty much every election, the one that loses claims there must have been something wrong.
Right.
And there have been, in my opinion, things wrong. There's a book about the Hopewell box in Nashville,
Tennessee.
Corruption for decades that was fixing elections. Lyndon Johnson was pretty known for his skill at
Tammany Hall.
Texas. Tammany Hall.
Tammany Hall up in New Jersey.
Yeah. So when power is at stake, people will cheat in order to get power.
Right.
So one of the other things the founders did was to establish rights, which is a whole other scheme of saying these things are beyond the purview of government. You can't tell people what they're going to say, right? Freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, which they called freedom of religion. I see those as parallel.
Right.
Freedom to assemble, et cetera. And so those negative rights, which are not entitlements as they've come to be over time, like we discussed in the last podcast, but the original concept of rights were negative. You cannot do this. This is beyond your power.
Right. Our Constitution was the government is to serve the people, not to rule the people.
Yes.
And so that's all part of this basic power, the struggle between power and authority and who has it. And at the founding of our country, the founding fathers did everything they could to keep that power at the individual level, and if they couldn't do it at the individual level, to at least do it at the local level.
Yes,
and
they thought a lot about property. So we're kind of bending over into the commercial or private side of things.
Right.
The original phrase was you have rights to life, liberty, and property.
Right.
That
was in 2 treatises of government. That's what John Locke wrote.
Yeah, the English theoretician that the founders drew on for a lot of the founding documents.
Yes.
life, liberty, and property. They backed away from property because if you have an absolute right to property, then how do you tax it? Right? It's limiting in some ways that they didn't want to do, so they changed it to pursuit of happiness.
Well, and Jefferson also believed that property is kind of like not all balls are footballs, but all footballs are balls, and so Jefferson believed that property would fall under pursuit of happiness. He wanted to expand actually the right of property to a larger right. You have the right to pursue happiness, which is a lot more than just property.
Well, I think we can say with confidence that the scope of property rights have been continually reduced over a long period of time. If you own a plot of land, what you can do with it is not exclusive to you.
Right.
It's highly regulated. And so there's good reason to regulate airplanes and drugs and to keep people safe from their effects. But there's a lot of, you see it in California now, I understand since the fires there, there's been one building permit issued.
One. Well, that was actually one building built. One house rebuilt because the building permit had actually been issued right before the fires.
Yeah, so the people that own those burned out properties, they don't really own them and have exclusive power to do with them what they want. They got to get a lot of permissions and clearances and licenses and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They're not free to do with their property as they see fit.
And some cities and jurisdictions, it's much more expensive to do things, which, by the way, nationwide, it's I read you'd read different articles about a shortage of housing, especially for lower income people, and a lot of that can be tied to there's now a regulatory cost that is attached to every that's associated with every new housing unit that drives up the cost of housing, not because it costs more to build it, but because of the regulatory hoops that you have to jump through and the brain damage that you have to go through to build.
The amount of effort that you mean brain damage, you mean the amount of sheer effort and diligence and persistence you have to even do it.
Which has a cost.
Yes.
A dollar cost associated with it. And so I mean,
this ties into our former themes of runaway costs, right? We've been commented pretty extensively about that. These are very connected issues. If you have the power to regulate, it runs up costs.
Right. So you were at a very interesting point, and that was the difference between persuasion.
Yes, I was going to say let's finish off with a discussion of persuasion because it's the alternative to power. I would suggest you may want to tweak that a little bit, but I think it's a useful way of thinking that investing power in people to tell other people what to do is one way of doing this. The other way is to persuade other people to do things the way you think is best. That's really what parliaments are for, legislatures are for. We were speaking earlier that the root word for parliament is parley, which means a conversation or a negotiation by parties that don't agree about things. So I think the founders' vision was the legislature will be the central place, like a marketplace, where people will be forced to come together and come up with mutual solutions. Our legislatures don't work so well here in the United States now because they're so polarized, they're frozen.
Well, that's because in order for legislatures to really be effective, you want to have competition among different groups, and that's where the states are. So we've over the last 100 years that's been changed. But the other thing is that you have what we call the rule of law and then equal treatment under the law. And so that's where you get into these questions where there was a period of time where women and black people in particular were not treated equally under the law. So we tried to establish laws to rectify that problem.
Yes.
We had amendments to the Constitution to rectify that problem. But then maybe the pendulum has swung too far where now people who want to use the law to be treated unequally under the law in their benefit, because the pendulum was the other way at some other point.
Critics of affirmative action are making that point. That it is discrimination by race or gender or
DEI. DEI is an overt. That may be not the right word, but
explicit.
Thank you. It is an explicit program to discriminate based on what somebody looks like.
And it's generally sometimes in the law. I mean, people have tried to make that into the law.
I'm saying,
but a lot of times it's policy in companies and universities, et cetera. It's still discriminatory.
Right.
in an opposite way. And so this is the debate. Do you need to have new discrimination to offset old discrimination? You're constantly moving the seesaw.
Yeah.
Or do you just say, we're not going to do it in any way? That's the case that just said, even if you're a member of the majority, you don't have to prove anything more than a other person to show you've been discriminated against.
Yeah. And I will
Some
say
people
this.
think discrimination only happens by empowered groups over disempowered ones, that racism only happens among majority groups. They define it out of existence for minorities. So, for instance, a Native American could not be prejudiced because they're disadvantaged.
Right.
They can't be racist. It only goes the other way.
Yeah.
If you can get away with that, it's a pretty effective way to get.
Well, then every smaller group then wants to have it, and then nobody is a member of the majority. In fact, there are no majorities now in this country.
Well, you're back to getting power by being a victim.
Right. And by the way, a growing economy solves many of these problems. Because once again, the fundamental human nature is everybody wants to improve their lot in life. If the size of the pie remains a constant size, then people are fighting over
a bigger slice of it.
Well, they're fighting over a bigger slice of something that's fixed.
Yes.
And that creates animosity between the citizens.
It's a zero-sum game.
Yes.
If I get more, you've got to get less.
Yes.
Or somebody's got to get
and
less.
And that's the difference between selfish and self-interest. But if the pie is getting constantly bigger, then goes a long way to mitigating the darker side of human nature.
Well, it's back to our point of innovation. That's how the pie gets bigger.
Yeah.
Is you let people be free to create and invent.
Yeah, and that gives individuals the authority and power over their own time.
That's right.
Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about how you move from force or power as force or compulsion, coercion, to persuasion. I think the vision of the founders was that the legislature would be a cauldron for resolving things. And when they don't resolve things, you have people really trying to get court decisions to force their way, to win at the court. And then if that goes too far, you basically are ruled by 9 people who have the ultimate say. It's not appealable unless you change the Constitution in some way.
Yeah.
Right. And that hasn't happened in over 50 years or 80. It's been maybe a century. But it just doesn't happen that you change the Constitution very easily. How do you get competing visions working to persuade one another and come up with an answer that is satisfactory or is acceptable, maybe is a better word, to both sides? It's not going to probably be preferred by either one, but it's acceptable to both sides. How do we do that?
Well, it's a part of what you do. I'm now going to look at the whole nation. Part of the way you do it is the way that we're organized by states. I mean, we live in Tennessee. I look at the laws that apply to the people in California, and I say I would never, as beautiful as the weather is in California, I would never want to live there.
Yeah.
I don't want to live under those rules. There are a lot of people from California who've moved to Tennessee.
Yeah.
And I've had discussions with them about why did you move from California? And they said, because we got tired of all of the taxes. We got tired of all of the ways that government makes my life more difficult. And so we finally decided to move. And
you have a lot of people coming from Illinois, from Chicago, from New York.
Right. And not many people moving the other direction.
Yes.
And so the way that you do it is you create competition among jurisdictions. That's the only way to do it, because human nature is what it is. And you want the better side of human nature to have the opportunity to create opportunities, and you want to limit the darker side of human nature.
Well, you have states then competing to attract people, and that may mean deregulating. It may mean cutting taxes. It may mean offering these kinds of freedoms that allow people to flourish.
Well, yeah, but it also just means that the people in Tennessee don't want to be taxed more than they want a government with a light touch.
Yes.
And so it's the officials who are elected in Tennessee are being responsive to the people who live in Tennessee.
Yes.
And the people who the legislature in California is being responsive to. I don't think it's necessarily being responsive to the average person in California, because there's some very powerful special interests in California that like and benefit from bigger government that are absent in Tennessee. And so the it's a constant battle. It's been going on since humans have existed, and that is you do want, but at the end of the day, I don't think anybody wants other people to have power. The people who want to have power over others do not want to let other people have power over them. So
That's well said.
Yeah. So it gets into, okay, well then let's agree that the only way that we're going to do something is through the power of persuasion.
Well, I have a related slant on this, and that is the bigger the stakes, the more people are going to fight over the steering wheel to control it. Okay.
Sure.
And part of the problem is the stakes are too high, the government is too big,
Yeah.
and too many people appeal to government to influence it. So the answer is the government to be smaller.
Yeah.
That's why I'm so enthusiastic about DOGE, finding ways to cut spending. For a long time, the federal government percent of GDP, I think, was measured at 17 or 18%.
Right.
And it fluctuated around that with tax rates and all. But with COVID, it jumped up to 22
You're
or 23.
talking about spending.
Spending, yeah.
Yeah.
It jumped
24.
up
Got to 24.
But it has not gone back.
Right.
Okay. And so
And that's where the battle is now.
And you have people acting as if the world is going to stop if that spending is not maintained.
Right. And we'll wrap up here, but every dollar that is spent, and some people might call it waste, but the recipient of that money considers it they're a constituent to that money. In other words, they don't see it as waste.
Oh, yeah.
And so they support and that's where the rub is. And there's nothing that forces the government. If the government, and we're not forced to, so we could say this, if we were forced to balance the budget, then the competing interests would have to all come and sit down at a table. Tennessee had a balanced budget requirement in the Constitution. So even when Tennessee, the legislature and we were governed by the Democrat Party, it acted responsively within the constraints of our state constitution.
Yeah.
The federal level doesn't have that, and so you have this constant battle. And
so the question is, and then how do you reduce the scope and size and power of government when they're not forced to reduce it?
And it's going to be whether or not, and that's a great question, and it's through the elections. It's frankly through judges recognizing the rule of law, the Constitution, and it has to be an educated voter.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
Well, maybe we've done our piece in helping a few people see some of the things we've seen.
Hope so.
We'll
Thanks,
pick it
Mike.
up again next week.
Thank you.